Albert Salas and I have been working on issues of social exclusion and specifically what we call what several sociologists refer to as a criminalization of poverty. So for us, it's kind of a joy to take some of these ideas that we've been discussing in more like statistical and kind of hardline materialist terms, and turn to the senses and kind of approach it from a different angle. So what I wanted to do today was begin with a premise, which is the idea that otherness is first and foremost a sensory experience. You interpret otherness, you become aware of otherness first through the senses, whether it's through vision and perceiving people wearing different colors than you're accustomed to, whether it's the feel of a very rough hand when you shake it, of someone who's doing very hard labor. And as an academic, I have soft pink hands because I don't do a lot of manual labor. Or whether it's by encountering different smells and spices. In Spain's not very accustomed to spices for the most part, and perhaps if you go eat Indian food, then you encounter that. Or if you're dealing with poverty, then you're going to encounter such smells, for instance, as maybe no deodorant, and you're going to smell another person's body. The clothing is not washed every day or every few days, and so on. All of these are sensory stimuli that you interpret immediately and associate with poverty. But beyond the sensorial aspect of it, the idea that I kind of brought up at one point in Cologne, but that I'd like to kind of get a little bit into here as well, is the idea that the senses are actually very unreliable as a source of information. That what you bring to the senses are what give it most of its meaning. If you don't interpret the senses through through your consciousness, then you're just bombarded with information and you're not filtering it out in any way. So with that in mind, this has a lot of different manifestations. So these in these photographs that you're seeing right here, by the way, are by Sarai Rua, who's a local photographer, and these are photographs of an improvised settlement that was evacuated in 2013 on the outskirts of the city. And I'll get into why I'm talking about this in a moment. But it was called Calafrica, or to the residents there was called Mount Zion, and 300 scrap metal workers, West African scrap metal workers, lived and worked in this abandoned factory for a long time. Now the question is, how did they end up there? And how did they end up there, and how did we perceive it when we arrive? Because the moment that you cross the wall of Mount Zion, you're crossing an important threshold, not only in the city, from the core of the city to the periphery. You're crossing a sensory threshold where suddenly you're going to be exposed to such things as the smell of metal, of lead, and of all of these exposures, which are actually extremely dangerous, toxic public health exposures, for instance. So why does this happen? The first thing that I'd like to propose, beyond the idea that otherness is primarily a sensorial experience, is related to that, which is the idea that we use the senses a lot of the time to build walls, to isolate specific aspects of each other. In fact, the neighborhood that we're in right now, the Raval, comes from the term arrabal, which is where contagious populations were warehoused. Poverty has always been a mass phenomenon, and it is generally dealt with as a storage issue. Where do you store the poor? And the Raval is where historically that happened. It was where you stored not just people who were poor, it was also where you stored people who were sick. It was where you stored people who might be considered morally toxic, for instance. These are the sort of things that become associated with it. So these are populations that are viewed in some way, either morally, socially, or even biologically, as contagious. So the scrap metal workers and all of the public health exposures that they were exposed to were not coincidental. What was happening there is that the city was actually trying to contain contagion. Yeah. sure. So there's another issue involved here, and this is in this informal squat. What's amazing about it is that the scrap metal workers that lived there were also some artists and different types of workers who were mostly expelled and fallen into a really serious state of poverty after the construction bubble burst, and they were left without jobs. No jobs meant they couldn't renew their papers, and so administratively they were also excluded from society and so on. They built all of the infrastructures that they were excluded from in the city. This is their own words that I got from interviews with them. And this is a bar, for instance, that they made called Black and White. And I thought it would be interesting to include that because black and white is actually, the distinctions that, it's the dualism or the duality that we use to make moral distinctions as well. And why am I bringing up the issue of moral distinctions? Well, one of the kind of interesting ideas that's coming out of social psychology and neuropsychology is, the idea that the anterior insula of the brain is where we house both the sense of disgust or revulsion and the sense of outrage and moral indignation. Now, if this is the case, that means that we've evolved biologically to the point where we associate things like cleanliness, things like disgust, with our own moral structures. And that's not surprising. If you look, if you think about the common expression that cleanliness is next to godliness, this comes from Mosaic, law, which is at the root of the three major religions, major Abrahamic religions that have colonized the vast majority of the world and therefore their moral structures. So if you look at what those ideas are, I mean, these were populations that were, for the most part, looking for ways to codify different types of behavior that were seen as detrimental to the group. So they would apply a moral code to cleanliness standards. That's why you have obviously the aversion to eating pork, shellfish, moral imperatives to wash your hands after each meal, or to give people a specific hand when you shake it, and all of these kinds of ideas. These are all very, very tightly linked, both in an in-group mentality, but also in sort of defining, of course, who the outsiders are. Now, I want to take this into another direction briefly, which is some research that was carried out by Valerie Curtis's team at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, where they found that the people who were most repulsed by unhygienic behavior are also the most likely to endorse throwing criminals in jail and imposing stiff penalties on those who break society's rules. Okay, so these are very, very related things. This is how we get from literal hygienism to social hygienism. This is where we get to where our kind of biological fears become manifest in the built environment. Another study of mock jurors found that those who were prone to disgust were more inclined to judge ambiguous evidence as proof of criminal wrongdoing, and to impose stiffer sentences, and to see the subject as wicked. And a final finding from one of these studies is that compared with less easily revolted counterparts, they were also more prone to harboring an exaggerated sense of the prevalence of crime in their own neighborhoods. So we find that this aversion to cleanliness, this aversion towards any form of filth, does have a manifestation in the moral realm, which is very routinely applied to the most excluded populations. So I kind of wanted to provide this kind of framework, and Alberto is going to get into kind of the specifics of like the sensory reaction to poverty.
As Carlos explained, otherness is a sensorial experience, so it's appropriate to explain some obvious reivindications in terms of social exclusion, because some of the reivindications from social movements or from more poor people in our cities are not as obvious as it seems for the rest of the citizens or population. I've been working in poverty issues since 2001, and specifically with homeless people in Barcelona since 2008, researching and as an activist. And my obvious reivindication last years and today is that homelessness is a matter of access to housing. Homelessness is a consequence of the failure of implementing the human right of housing. And this seems a very obvious sentence, but it's not at all. We are used to consider homelessness as a social illness, needed of a social treatment. We are used to the stereotype to the homeless as a beggar living in the streets and with a life, with a story of life, with some addictions and connected with alcoholism and other personal elections that gave them this kind of life. The thing is, this the construction of this otherness, because this is not the stereotype is not the reality, the empirical reality. Our image of homelessness are conditioned by the necessity of give them the category of persons needed of social treatment and persons object of social policies, not subjects of political rights, political and social rights. And the most important cause of this is their invisibility. They are not visible for us. They are not visible when they are in the streets. There's a very interesting study made in 2012 by two researchers in Princeton and from Princeton and Duke universities. They tried to see which areas of the brain were activated when people saw a homeless person in the street, and they saw that the areas were the same than when these people saw a bank or a tree. Not the areas activated by the contact with other people. So we are used to consider them like objects in the public space. The thing is, we are not considering people, the persons who are in the public space most of the time, and we are not able to understand the process to arrive to a homelessness situation, because we are not seeing the invisible homelessness, the most invisible homelessness, the one that is lived inside equipments, shelters, hostels. Because in Barcelona we have around 900 people sleeping on road every night, but we have around 2,000 sleeping every night in shelters and other kind of refugees, private and public funded. So we have around 3,000 homeless people in the city, but we are only seeing, when we see them, 900 of them. And we are used to see the most hard phase of poverty, ignoring the process to arrive them. So it's very easy to have to be distant from this poverty, because we cannot understand the steps before the street. And it's very difficult because the image, the stereotypes are reproduced constantly by the media, and they are reproducing this stereotype of the long-term homeless person, long-term beggar in the street. But this is not the empirical reality, as I said, because the majority of people is in the street just some short periods, and they are combining the street with pensions, illegally rented rooms, and trying to survive between the street and other kinds of homelessness, and trying to avoid shelters, trying to avoid other kind of resources we give to them. The consequences of this building of an otherness with the most poor people in our streets is that we are not able to see them, but we are not able to touch them, to build community with them. I'd like to well, it's very interesting to think when you have touched a person who is begging in the street, who is sleeping in the street. When you have shook hands with them, probably never, because they are another category, and they are a problematic category. And the consequences, policies we think are good for them are policies that they try to avoid to be involved, like building shelters. And then we cannot understand why some people prefers to be in the streets than in shelters. And probably is because shelters are the way to institutionalize them and the way to make them more invisible. So we are fighting for two big rights, and we are trying to involve homeless people in the struggle for these two rights: the right of housing, the human right of housing, and the right to the city. Because even when they have not the housing right recognized, they have the right to be in the public space without being expelled from our streets. So that's all. Thank you.